Welcome back. Our special guest this evening is Mr. Gurcharan Das, author, commentator, columnist, public intellectual who's been in the business of writing for the last 25 years. And his latest book, Karma, the Riddle of Desire, has hit the stands. It is in this book that he explores the evolution of sex and desire in India, the dichotomies, the dilemmas, and the duplicities that exist in our society. I welcome you to Mirror Now. Mr. Gurcharan Das is live with us here on the broadcast. Mr. Gurcharan Das, welcome to Mirror Now. I want to begin by asking you that your book is called Karma, the Riddle of Desire. It's supposed to be third in the trilogy. First one, Artha, on material well-being. Second, on spiritual well-being. So what is this one about? Is it about sexual well-being? And what exactly is the riddle of desire?
Well, you're right. This is the third of the trilogy. The first book was called India Unbound, and that was about the goal of Artha, which is material well-being. My second book was called The Difficulty of Being Good, and that was about the moral well-being. And this is called Karma, the Riddle of Desire, and this is really about the emotional well-being, not only of an individual, but of the whole society. Okay. And I think it's important to talk about emotional well-being because for too long we have repressed our emotions and we have lived with patriarchic stereotypes.
Yes. So when you talk about repression, that brings me to the question. We just had an iconic landmark decision by the Supreme Court to decriminalize homosexuality in this country. Can you hear me, Gurcharan Das? I think we have a problem with the audio connection. Can you hear me, sir? Okay, we'll try and reconnect. But for the sake of our viewers, I would like to just talk about this book, and also the fact that it talks about a society that has been repressed for far too long. The protagonist of this book, as Gurcharan Das will tell us once we reconnect, is Amar, who is caught in a dilemma between his moral principles and his sinful desire, so-called dharam sankat, as it were. So that's the conflict that this book sort of explores. And, one must, of course, again understand in the larger context the issue of repression in a society like ours that has raised its ugly head in many ways. For the longest time, we had homosexuality criminalized. It's only the recent judgment that has been done away with. But in other ways as well, the repression has caused us a lot of harm since it raises its ugly head in the form of sexual crimes. And I would like to understand from Mr. Gurcharan Das whether the book also goes into that, because it's extremely important to bring this back on the table. Mr. Gurcharan Das, I was going into the point about how we have only recently had this decision, had this judgment from the Supreme Court that decriminalizes homosexuality. And do you think that's a coming of age moment for this country? And your book also, in a way, brings the conversation to the table about sexuality, about discussing this issue and not leading that extremely repressed life that you were just mentioning just a short while back.
Right. Well, this is a very good example because, in fact, it's a personal case because my son is gay. Okay. And until 12:35 p.m. last Thursday, I was very reluctant to talk about it in public. But after the Supreme Court judgment, I feel perfectly easy to do it. And I think this is a coming of age of our society, and this is a very good example of the emotional health of a society, how it can change. We all want to be happy, and my one-line answer to being happy is to love the work you do and love the person you live with. But the classical Indian life, the ancients, they had a solution to happiness and a flourishing life, which consisted of four what they call the four purusharthas, the four aims of life. And they were artha, dharma, kama, and moksha. Now, my book now deals with kama. And this is one of the subjects that we brush under the carpet.
Yes.
We don't talk about it. And I think that that it was time that we did speak about it.
Mr. Gurcharan Das, you have also said...
Let me
Yes.
give you an idea.
No, I want to quote you because
go
you
ahead.
have said India is the only civilization to have elevated karma to a goal of life, and that is something you just mentioned again. Yet it took us 150 years to accept a certain form of sexual orientation. Why this dichotomy? Why such duplicity?
Yes. Well, this is it's a complex matter. We tend to blame the British. Of course, the law on criminalizing homosexuality was enacted by the British Raj, and they removed it from their books in the 60s. But it took us another 50 years to remove it from our
Yes.
books. And so to some extent it is the Victorian influence of the British. But we should not blame the British alone. If from the very beginning we have what I call karma pessimists.
Okay.
The rishis, the yogis, the Buddha, these people had a lot of problem with desire. They felt it interfered with their spiritual project. So while we had a strand of karma optimism in our society that elevated karma to a goal of life, because people felt that karma is the source of all action. You wouldn't wake up in the morning if you did not experience desire. It's the source of creation. It's a source of procreation.
Right,
And
but
creation,
talking about karma
why?
pessimist,
Because,
do you
unlike
also
in
have an
the-
example of a karma optimist? Because I believe on an earlier occasion you spoke about Mahatma Gandhi being a karma pessimist. Can you explain to us what is this concept about? And is there a compromise between a karma optimist and a karma pessimist? Is there one from history who qualifies as a karma optimist as well?
Right. Well, we had a whole strand of karma optimism, which was sort of culminated in the Kama Sutra and the temples at Khajuraho, etc. And all our great Sanskrit love poetry was written by karma optimists. Now, I told you about karma pessimists. The compromise that was reached in history in the struggle between karma optimists and karma pessimists was karma realists, and they said that sex is all right as long as it is within marriage. And this compromise took place in all societies which accepted this notion, and in India it
Right.
was enacted in our dharma shastras.
So what does this book tell us? Does this pose a riddle for us in terms of the conflict that the human mind goes through when it is faced with a situation where you have, say, a sinful desire conflicting with your individual principle? Is that what the book explores? Tell us more about that.
Well, I'll give you one example of the riddle of desire. And that is in the middle of my book. The hero, the protagonist or the narrator of the story, his name is Amar, and he's in his 40s, and he has spent his life slogging away at work, climbing ladders, and he has reached the top of his career. He's spent his time slogging away at home, bringing up his children. The desire between him and his wife has waned, although it's a happy marriage because they both love each other. He loves his family. But he asks himself one day, is this what life was all about? And the following day, he's on a train going to Pune by the Deccan Queen, and a beautiful woman comes and sits next to him on the train. And they begin to chat, and it's pretty clear that there's chemistry between them. And by the end of the journey, they're drawn to each other, and it's clear to both of them that this might lead to an affair. And so he agonizes before plunging in. And he asks himself, well, if should I have this affair? And if I do, what will happen? One, my marriage will be devastated. I will hurt the person who I love the most, my wife. I will also hurt my children in the process. And then he says, well, maybe if I keep this secret, and they won't find out. And this is often what happens to all of us. But then he says that the consequence of that would be that I'll have to lie, and lies will have to pile up upon other lies, and eventually I will become an inauthentic human being.
Right.
And so he says, well, maybe he shouldn't have an affair, but what will be the consequence of that? The consequence of not having the affair will be that I will resent this for the rest of my life. I will resent my wife, my family, myself, that here was my last chance for a thrilling kind of happiness.
Yes.
And
so,
I did not take it.
Right.
And maybe I will become a mean, old, shriveled man. And so this is a classic conflict between dharma and karma.
Right.
Dharma means a duty to the other, and karma is a duty to yourself.
So is that the reason why you called Gandhi a karma pessimist? Because you said...
We forget.
Right. By that logic, and that brings me to this question, that is that the reason why, in your assessment, a Gandhi would be a karma pessimist? Because the duty towards the society always, took precedence over the self.
Well, Gandhi, like most karma pessimists, advocated celibacy. And frankly, he got this idea not from the Indian tradition, from the yogis and the rishis and all that. He got it from Tolstoy. And there's a story of Tolstoy called the Kreutzer Sonata. And this was, frankly, for society, an unpractical solution. And so, it's unpractical because the society won't survive. And that story of Tolstoy was banned for this reason in Russia. And so I would say that Gandhi was a very great man, but this was one of his crazy ideas.
Okay. Now, bringing things to the present context, I would like to understand from you, since you have brought out the issue of sexuality and repression as well to the center stage, that, a lot of people think that because of this severe sense of repression is why we have, sexual crimes to the extent that we do in a country like ours. Do you subscribe to that view? Do you think one of the reasons is because we don't address or don't have an outlet for that kind of energy?
Well, I think repression is not good. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But there's no evidence in the world which links violence to repression. There are hypotheses that many psychologists have made.
Yes.
But we don't have hard evidence. But frankly, for a country to live an emotionally healthy life, people should be able to talk about their real fears, their inner lives. The parents should be able to talk about it to their children. Teachers should be able to talk about it.
Yes.
And frankly, husband and wife should be able to talk about it. And so, frankly, also, since the 90s, the younger generation has become a lot more liberated, and they are a lot freer, and that's a very good thing that they are freer. But we are living also in a political environment today, which I would call, the Hindu right is like the neo-Victorians, and this is not something that they would favor.
Right. And before I let you go, Mr. Gurcharan Das, since you call it a fictional memoir, does it have a resonance in your own life?
Well, it is fictional, but frankly, every writer, even the greatest fiction writers, they draw a lot from their lives. They draw a lot from the lives of their friends, their relatives, and in the end, at the end of the day, the line between fiction and non-fiction is a blurred line. It's porous, and the only difference being that fiction has to make sense. Life doesn't have to make sense.
Right. So this is the third book in the trilogy. Is with that, is your thought process complete, or there is more that the reader can expect from you? What's next, Mr. Das?
Well, certainly the fourth goal of life is moksha, which is spiritual well-being. But I'm an agnostic, and I think you have to be a believer to really write about moksha. And so I don't think I'm capable. My father was a mystic. He would have been capable of writing it, but not me. I actually think that every generation should revisit the idea of India. And the last time the idea of India was visited was by Nehru 80 years ago in the discovery of India. And I'd like to do that. I'd like to revisit the idea of India. I think Nehru had some wonderful ideas in his book, but there were many things he got wrong. And also, I have access to Sanskrit sources, which Nehru did not. And so I think I can connect the past with the present in a more organic way. And this is the right time, because we are being given a narrative by the Hindu right, which is not a correct narrative.
Right.
They have all these technological fantasies from the Puranas and all. And that's not what our past was all about.
Right.
But to be a healthy society, we should revisit the idea of India. It's an evolving idea. So maybe that's what I'll do.
That's a beautiful note to end the program with, and you've put it so well that the emotional life of a country and civilization is as important as the political and social life, and we perhaps need more authors like yourself, Mr. Gurcharan Das. Thanks so much for joining us and for having this conversation. We need to have more of these conversations perhaps, and discuss and perhaps also explore the sexuality, the evolution of sex and desire in this country, something that the country has always been squeamish about. Many thanks to you, Mr. Gurcharan Das, for joining us here on Mirror Now this evening.
Yeah.
With that, it's time for us to take a very short break. Thanks for joining us here on Mirror Now.